Of all the actors who rose to fame in the 1980s, there's an upper echelon of names that anyone would recognize. Schwarzenegger and Stallone are two, and the next one, of course, on that list is Bruce Willis. He's most often associated with his classic role as John McClane in the Die Hard franchise, amongst countless other roles both critically acclaimed and derided. Willis has made a career out of mainstream successes like Die Hard, Armageddon, and Look Who's Talking, while also taking riskier turns in films like Unbreakable, Pulp Fiction, The Fifth Element, and 12 Monkeys. And you know what? They were risky, but they were all hits.
Whose chopper is this?
Zed's.
Who's Zed?
Zed's dead, baby. Zed's dead.
Willis has also stretched himself as an actor with movies that are beloved by fans despite not being hits. One such hit, of course, is 1991's Hudson Hawk, which almost ended his career, but 30 years later is kind of seen as a cult classic. While Willis's recent VOD output has strayed from his best work for obvious reasons that were only recently revealed, let's take a look back at one of the actor's first big roles in a movie that a lot of people overlook, the 1987 Blake Edwards comedy Blind Date.
Is she reasonably good looking?
Reasonably doesn't begin to describe it. I'm looking at a picture of her right now and I'm telling you, she's an honest-to-God knockout.
This is basically Bruce Willis's first credited big screen role, although he was already well known at the time because he was a star on Moonlighting on TV. This was the movie that helped him break out into films, and it also featured Kim Basinger, John Larroquette, and the late Phil Hartman. Written by Dale Launer, Blind Date went through numerous rewrites before it finally landed a director. Launer does hold the screenwriting credit on the movie, but has since distanced himself from the version that went in front of the cameras. Blind Date struggled in early development when it was a potential vehicle for the recently married Sean Penn and Madonna. The actor and singer were excited for the comedy project, but when the movie could not find a director, the pair exited. In a funny twist, Penn and Madonna would eventually find a movie to star in, 1986's Shanghai Surprise, and that movie would turn out to be a massive failure and is considered, in fact, one of the worst films ever made.
He didn't even finish the nipples on my little sweetheart.
Beatle George Harrison produced Shanghai Surprise via his Handmade Films production company, which also, for a while, held the rights to Blind Date. Handmade Films sold the rights to Blake Edwards, the legendary filmmaker behind such classics as Breakfast at Tiffany's, The Pink Panther, and 10. Thank you for watching JoBlo videos. If you enjoy our shows, please subscribe to our channel right now, like this video, and click on the bell so you'll be notified each time a new video goes up. Now, back to the show. Edwards signed on as director of Blind Date under the condition that substantial rewrites be made to the script. Edwards had served as a writer on the majority of his directorial efforts before Blind Date and had performed uncredited adjustments to the film alongside Leslie Dixon, Tom Ropolowski, and Michael Allen Eddy. When Edwards came on board, Madonna was courted again for the lead but turned it down when Sean Penn would not be considered. Bruce Willis earned the role likely due to his growing popularity from the network comedy drama Moonlighting, which began airing in 1985.
You know I got it. All I'm asking is for respect.
Willis would reteam with Edwards for a second time in the much less successful 1988 film Sunset.
Now what I got here is a 12-gauge full choke shotgun. You just go ahead and count 3, Dutch. Let's see who gets killed first.
Edwards recruited Kim Basinger for the role of Nadia after having cast her in 1983's The Man Who Loved Women and considering her for Bo Derek's iconic role in 1979's Dudley Moore comedy 10. Blind Date would be Blake Edwards' 45th directorial effort and featured many of his frequent collaborators. Composer Henry Mancini partnered with Edwards for the 24th time of their illustrious career, which garnered the musicians 4 Academy Awards from 12 nominations. Comedian Graham Stark worked with Blake Edwards on 7 Pink Panther movies and Victor Victoria before appearing in this film as Jordan the Butler. Edwards also brought in musicians Billy Vera and the Beaters for multiple songs in this film after previously performing in his 1986 movie A Fine Mess. Blind Date was produced by Tony Adams, a collaborator on 5 films with Blake Edwards. Cinematographer Harry Stradling Jr., a 4-time collaborator with Edwards, served as the director of photography. Filmed from May to July 1986, Blind Date made great use of the Los Angeles area, including properties owned by the Hilton family. Interior sequences were shot at Blake Edwards' own corporate headquarters, Laird Studios. In another interesting bit of trivia, Blind Date shares a connection with Willis's then-future hit Die Hard. In scenes set in David Bedford's office, the Fox building can be seen under construction outside. Missing windows and some upper-level touches, this is the site that would forever become known with its fictional name of Nakatomi Plaza.
Come out to the coast. We'll get together, have a few laughs.
Produced for $16 million, Blind Date would go on to box office success with a gross just shy of $40 million. So why have many of you never heard of it? Well, critics did not like this movie, which only holds a 21% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Most critics found moments to appreciate in it, but wrote it off as a series of sight gags that didn't work well together. It's definitely easy to overlook Blind Date in the wake of Die Hard, which opened the following year, but there's a lot to appreciate in this movie, which had Willis working with one of the most acclaimed comedy directors of all time. Blind Date plays with the madcap comedy that Edwards himself honed in the Pink Panther films. The story follows Willis as Walter Davis, and in another fun note, Willis's legal first name actually is Walter, Bruce's his middle name. Walter is a workaholic who is set up by his brother Ted, played by Phil Hartman, on a date with Ted's wife's cousin, Nadia, played by the gorgeous Kim Basinger.
You've tried to find me Miss Right before, only you always forget to mention one crucial detail, like she's a dope addict or a lesbian, or keeps a dead cat in the freezer.
Ted's wife tells him to warn Walter that when Nadia gets drunk that her behavior can become erratic.
You get her drunk, she loses control.
But Walter takes this as a joke rather than a serious issue. When they first meet, Nadia and Walter hit it off right away, but things take a bad turn when Nadia goes wild after getting a couple of cocktails in her. Things go worse when Nadia and Walter begin getting stalked by her ex-boyfriend David, played by the hilarious John LaRoquette. David crops up regularly throughout their evening, attacking Walter and crashing his car several times.
I'll kill you!
This madcap evening gets Walter fired and eventually arrested, driving him insane. Blind Date shifts the comedy between Basinger and Willis, with one acting kooky while the other plays it straight. Early in the movie, Basinger gets to do the broad comedy while Willis maintains his composure, but as the film progresses, we see the roles reverse, allowing the two actors to play different kinds of comedy throughout. Many of the funniest sequences in the film are staged in the traditional manner that gives the movie the look of an older film, despite the 1980s fashion, music, and dialogue. The manic performance that Bruce Willis gives as the increasingly unhinged Walter was one of the first signs of his talents as an actor. As he yells and pulls his hair out due to the shenanigans surrounding him, you can see early indicators of what Willis would bring to Die Hard and countless films over the following decades.
Moonwalk! I hate that shit!
It's hilarious to see him do the opposite of subtle, but it's a performance that makes the film work well. And of course, Bruce Willis isn't the whole show here. Kim Basinger is actually quite funny in her role as Nadia. You never really see Kim Basinger play kooky outside of, maybe My Stepmother's an Alien, but she really did have a flair for comedy.
I mean, it sort of makes me go crazy.
But best of all is John LaRoquette off of the TV show Night Court, where he was famous for playing the horny Dan Fielding.
What's he so happy about? Hard to say. Last time he acted like that, he'd just run over the cat.
Here he's, horny and crazy, but in this case he's a bad guy, whereas Dan Fielding was always kind of a good guy. The movie follows all of the many expected beats of a farcical comedy, complete with a happy ending that features a pool, and also featured later on in the music video for the Cars song Magic. Running a lean 95 minutes, Blind Date is a fast and fun comedy that brings Edwards' traditional directorial style to a new generation of audience. There are a few filmmakers who are able to stage zany comedy like this, and not many other films are able to take such a silly idea and make it big screen worthy. Blind Date should be at the top of your list of unknown Bruce Willis movies to watch because it was really his first breakout hit and a rare kind of solo zany comedy for him. Willis made a lot of movies that were funny, but not necessarily solo comedies. As we look back at the legendary career of Mr. Willis, this is an unknown gem that should be revisited. For many, the spaghetti western movement of the late 60s was arguably the last hurrah for the western. Long one of Hollywood's most popular genres throughout the 70s, unless it starred Clint Eastwood's, the genre simply sank like a stone at the box office. But of course, this didn't mean that Hollywood didn't try to revive it every now and then. The Missouri Breaks enlisted Jack Nicholson and Marlon Brando, but the results were a disaster, and the same studio made an even bigger western bomb a few years later called Heaven's Gate, which almost killed the genre for good, and even Clint Eastwood stopped making westerns. But In 1985, funny enough, two big Western movies hit theaters. One of them, of course, was Clint Eastwood's return to the genre that he had long forsaken, Pale Rider, and would be his last Western until Unforgiven. And the other was a movie that's kind of forgotten now, but is an underseen cult classic that's just waiting to be discovered. Lawrence Kasdan's Silverado, which is this week's best movie you never saw.
I'm gonna enjoy this.
You're late. It's a bad start, boys.
Yes, sir. That means we'll just have to get you people to Silverado that much quicker.
All right, let's get going.
So in this one, Scott Glenn plays a cowboy named Emmett who's just got out of prison after a 5-year stint for a crime he didn't commit, in classic Western hero fashion. He's a cowboy and he heads to a small town called Silverado to pick up his kind-hearted but deadly young brother, Jake, played by Kevin Costner. And along the way, he rescues a gambler named Payton, played by Kevin Kline, and a black cowboy named Mal, played by Danny Glover. Once in Silverado, these four fast friends realize the town is being ruled over by Emmett's old nemesis, who's in league with a former friend of Payton's and is now the town's crooked sheriff, Cobb, played by Brian Dennehy.
I never enjoyed killing a man.
Eager to settle down, all four men find themselves challenged by the ruthless factions that run the town and will have to unite to save the day.
Want one of these? This ought to do.
Now, in addition to our heroes played by Kevin Kline, Scott Glenn, Kevin Costner, and Danny Glover, plus the villains, who are played by Brian Dennehy and a very young Jeff Fahey, there's a bunch of other people in this movie that are pretty notable for the era. There's John Cleese.
As you may have guessed, I am not from these parts.
There's Jeff Goldblum.
Sheriff, I'm a gambler who'd like to run an honest game here in your town. To whom do I speak about that? Hope it's not this gentleman.
There's Roseanne Arquette, and there's Linda Hunt, who had just won an Oscar for The Year of Living Dangerously, in which she played a man.
The world is what you make of it, friend. If it doesn't fit, you make alterations.
This, of course, was Lawrence Kasdan's follow-up to The Big Chill, which had been a huge hit in 1983, and had helped establish Kevin Kline as a star.
Making a big mistake.
That's what I told him.
So, as I said earlier, in 1985, a mini revival of sorts was taking place for the Western. Clint Eastwood had returned to the genre with Pale Rider, while writer-director Lawrence Kasdan, who was definitely riding high off the success of Body Heat and The Big Chill, not to mention his work on the screenplays for The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, got the chance to make his own Western epic. It was very much in the mold of a Golden Age John Ford-era Western, rather than the spaghetti westerns that were popular about a decade or so before. Silverado took the fun-loving, high-adventure vibe that Kasdan had brought to his Lucasfilm classics and adapted it to the genre, making a thoroughly entertaining outer that really should have been a hit, but alas, wasn't really. It did very modest business, grossing $32 million on a $23 million budget. It wasn't a disaster, and by the time it hit video and Laserdisc, it probably eked out a profit. But, unfortunately, it had the misfortune of opening the very same weekend as Back to the Future. So, guess what happened? Nowadays, it's best remembered as Kevin Costner's first big role. Right. Now, why was Kevin Costner in this movie? That's the interesting story. You see, Kevin Costner originally played the friend in The Big Chill that committed suicide and who they're all uniting to mourn. There was originally a big flashback sequence in the movie that ran 15 to 20 minutes that explained why the character committed suicide, but Kasdan felt that the movie was simply more powerful, leaving his motivations a mystery. So, Kevin Costner was almost completely cut out of the movie, although if you watch The Big Chill now, you can see that when the corpse is being dressed at the beginning of the movie, with his hair being combed, it's very clearly Kevin Costner's body that they're doing this to, which is kind of interesting. It's strange though, because Costner is quite a few years younger than most of his co-stars would have been in The Big Chill, so probably it was better that he was left out of the movie anyway. And what a hell of a role he got in Silverado, as it pretty much established him as a star overnight. Once this movie came out, Orion Pictures saw it and snapped him up to a contract where he got to do 2 movies that made him a massive star. No Way Out, opposite Sean Young, which was famous, of course, for that love scene in the back of a limousine, and then the great Bull Durham. Back to Silverado. This movie is so much fun that it's insane to think that it never really spawned a Western franchise, as the movie kind of cries out for it at the end of the film. I mean, it's left wide open for a sequel, and it could have sustained a whole series of films. Heck, if a movie like Silverado was popular nowadays, I would bet that all 4 of the leads probably would have gotten spin-offs. Kasdan should still be making Silverado adventures 30 years later, especially with the fact that all 4 guys are still kind of going. I mean, Scott Glenn, Danny Glover, Kevin Kline, and Kevin Costner, heck, they could all still be doing westerns, and Kevin Costner, let's not forget, is still doing westerns, with him being the lead, for now anyway, of Yellowstone and making his own massive western epic called Horizon.
Maybe I love our man-to-man talks, but we need to set some goddamn boundaries here.
This is definitely Lawrence Kasdan at his prime. He's now mostly remembered as a writer, but he was a heck of a writer-director back then. And his writing and craftsmanship is on point right from the opening of the film, which finds Scott Glenn's Emmett descended upon by a gang of hired killers, who he makes short work of. After dispatching him, he opens the door to display the grandeur of John Bailey's scope cinematography, leading us on an adventure that doesn't let up for 2 hours. It's beautifully cast, with Scott Glenn making a case for himself as one of the great screen cowboys, playing the Henry Fonda-like Emmett, a moral, upstanding hero who's a stark contrast to the spaghetti western anti-heroes that were more in vogue at the time. Even compared to Clint Eastwood, he's a real kind of straight-shooting guy.
You be careful. You're in it now. It's gonna get mean.
He can always be relied upon to do what's right. He's kind of more of a Randolph Scott type than even a John Wayne type, really. He's ably supported by an atypically cast Kevin Kline as the smart-mouthed gambling man who's constantly at war with his own good nature, making him the one with the real hero's quest.
Stand up real slow and let me see. You might live through this night.
Kline rarely did action movies, but he looked really cool as a cowboy, and like Glenn, seemed born for the role he ended up playing. And indeed, at the end of the film, he kind of emerges as the hero, although Scott Glenn carves up a way higher body count. Ditto Kevin Costner, who, as I mentioned earlier, was cast as a way of making up for the fact that Kasdan had cut him out of The Big Chill. What a favor he did for him, as you couldn't pick a better star-making part than this, with Jake, the live-wire young hero, with more energy than brains, but also a kindly nature that makes him easy to root for. And he also gets the best gunfight, where he goes up against Jeff Fahey's Tyree, which is a name that, of course, Kasdan took from a bunch of John Ford movies. That's the character that the great Ben Johnson always played in his films. It's no wonder that Silverado led to Costner becoming a huge star, and I don't think that he would have been cast in The Untouchables if he hadn't been put in this movie. And of course, that film, along with the aforementioned No Way Out and Bull Durham, made him a megastar. The heroic foursome is rounded out by Danny Glover as a black cowboy, which to this day is still a rare figure in American films, or at least was until Netflix recently had a hit with The Harder They Fall. Glover's character winds up being one of the deadliest heroes of them all, with him having a grudge against Jeff Goldblum's diabolical card sharp, leading to a cool moment of vengeance that, I wouldn't be a bit surprised, might have paved the way for his eventual casting in Lethal Weapon. The supporting cast is just as strong, with Brian Dennehy a very likable villain, and he kills a youngish, at least youngish, Richard Jenkins early in the film, who kind of looks like Richard Jenkins now. And then there's John Cleese of Monty Python fame, atypically cast as an Old West sheriff, and not half bad in the role, and the always cool James Gammon, who I always really liked in these movies.
You brought a posse to my best hideout, and you asked me if I mind?
Of the cast, I would say only the female roles really get short-shifted a bit, with it seeming like Rosanna Arquette's role wound up on the cutting room floor. Oh well. One also needs to single out the amazing score by Bruce Broughton, with helping to make him the de facto Western composer of the day, with Tombstone being another of his great Western scores. Kasdan would eventually get a chance to return to the genre with star Kevin Costner in Wyatt Earp, but despite some good moments, it simply doesn't hold a candle to the great Silverado, or even the Wyatt Earp movie that it went up against, Tombstone. Lawrence Kasdan himself went on record saying that despite having written The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, he's simply not the world's greatest believer in sequels. He thinks you should just make one good movie and move on.
I'm running out of deputies.
Fair enough, Lawrence. Fair enough. Silverado, of course, is available to rent and buy on most digital services and on Blu-ray and DVD with some pretty good special features. You can also find it show up on Crackle from time to time. While it never spawned a franchise, Silverado remains a Western classic that's just aching to be rediscovered, even if you're not a huge fan of the genre. Hopefully those of you that haven't seen it will give it a watch, as it's a real gem.
Bye, cop. Goodbye, babe.
The passing of Patrick Swayze was enough to break your heart. Has there ever really been anyone quite like him? At his best, Patrick Swayze was the type of guy who was equally at home playing romantic leads as he was dropping bad guys in action flicks. Swayze's career hit its peak in 1987 when he danced his way to the top of the box office in Dirty Dancing.
Nobody puts baby in a corner.
It made him a giant star, with him not only having one of the top grossing movies of the year, but also a huge hit song and a track off the soundtrack album, She's Like the Wind. While traditional thinking would have led to Swayze acting in a whole slew of romantic movies, he had something a little different in mind.
Ready or not, here comes Mama.
Swayze wanted to become an action hero. The fact is, he was a natural for the genre. His dance training and general physical prowess made him a natural at fight scenes, and while he was a really good-looking dude, he wasn't overly pretty and could conceivably play a badass.
All you have to do is follow 3 simple rules.
He also had amazing hair, which was a prerequisite to be an action hero in the 80s, with his feathered hair perhaps only equaled by the godlike mullet sported by Kurt Russell.
It's all in the reflexes.
While everyone remembers Roadhouse, which despite underperforming in 1989 became a massive cult classic,
expect the unexpected.
It wasn't the only action flick Swayze made that year.
Looks like you fellas had a little trouble.
Towards the end of 1989, he starred in another action movie called Next of Kin.
My daddy said you used to be good with the bow and arrow before you went off to the city and forgot everything.
While largely obscure in his filmography, it's a better-than-average thriller anchored by Swayze's charisma and a scene-stealing turn by young Liam Neeson, who is practically a co-lead here, and it's our pick for one of the best movies you never saw.
I told you, nothing kinky. This is kinky.
Ask anybody here whether your big city cops ever cared about us, living or dead.
We are gonna find Gerald's killer, and as soon as we make a case, he is going up for murder 1.
Damn it, man. He was our brother.
In Next of Kin, Swayze plays a Chicago cop named Truman Gates.
My name is Truman Gates. I'm the brother of the North Side employee who was killed the night of August the 8th.
Who hails from the Appalachians. One of his younger brothers, Gerald, played by a young Bill Paxton, followed him to Chicago but is killed by Chicago mobsters who hijack his truck.
And I'm the one in the middle catching all the shit.
He's coldly executed by a psychotic muscle man for the mob, Adam Baldwin's Joey Rossellini.
These people are animals. They don't give a fuck about anybody.
Much to the chagrin of his more even-tempered boss, Papa John, played by Andreas Katsoulas.
Settle this. Now.
Better known as the one-armed man from The Fugitive and Jakar from Babylon 5. While Truman swears to bring mobsters to justice, his older brother Briar, played by Liam Neeson, ain't having it. He hightails it to Chicago and declares war on the mobsters. It's interesting to see him in action, as his role here predates his later status as an action hero in movies like Taken. In fact, Neeson still makes movies that are an awful lot like Next of Kin, although this is certainly more energetic and action-driven than the lower-budgeted fare we usually get from Neeson these days.
Box of tricks? That's right. I've been led to understand that tricks are exclusively for children.
Well, I mean, they say tricks are for kids in the commercials.
And is that enforced by law?
Not to my knowledge, no.
As good as he is, though, this is Patrick Swayze's movie, with it effortlessly combining his romantic appeal with his action hero bona fides.
You follow what I'm saying?
He gets a better romantic story than usual for the genre, with him happily married to Helen Hunt's elegant Chicago violinist, who becomes pregnant as the movie goes on. This gives Swayze motivation for trying to do things within the law, as he doesn't want to endanger his family. Yet, as the movie goes on and the mob becomes more violent, Tucker's rage is unleashed, leading to a balls-to-the-wall climax where Truman, armed with a bow and arrow, as well as a hillbilly army of pals, goes to war on the mafia.
What the fuck gets into these people of yours, Gates?
While not as action-packed as Roadhouse or Point Break, Next of Kin is a solid cop movie for Swayze. It's the kind of beat programmer that guys like JCVD and Steven Seagal would be starring in by the decade's end. It's strange that Swayze never really managed to make it to action hero status, as most of his movies within the genre are actually pretty good. Perhaps it was the fact that so much of his target audience were women, and guys at the time anyway probably viewed him as less manly than his contemporaries. That's a huge mistake though, as Swayze's confidence makes him a guy whose vehicles have aged a lot better than others. Swayze's machismo was lower key, as he wasn't afraid to be vulnerable or cry in his movies, something that Stallone and Russell also were perfectly comfortable doing, although they didn't get the grief that he did.
Sometimes I wake up and know where I am.
In a lot of ways, the end of Swayze's run as an action hero can probably be chalked up to the success of his next movie, Ghost, which solidified his status as a romantic idol. Swayze's career as an action hero never really recovered, as Point Break, despite being a masterpiece, was more considered a Keanu Reeves movie, while his later film, Black Dog, which is pretty damn good too, was a bit of a flop. Nonetheless, Next of Kin is a nifty little film with above-average direction by journeyman director John Irvin, who also helmed Arnold Schwarzenegger's Raw Deal and the excellent Hamburger Hill. It even has Patrick Swayze singing the theme song, Brothers, something he also did in Roadhouse, but his singing career seems to have tapered off a lot after that. My only issue with Next of Kin is that Adam Baldwin seems very miscast as an Italian hoodlum, with him doing a lame wise guy accent.
You act like I was supposed to know his brother was a cop. He's a fucking hillbilly. How many hillbilly cops you know about, Frank?
He's also very easily dominated in the final action scene. Keep your eyes peeled for a young Ben Stiller in an early role as Papa John's beloved son, while Andreas Katsoulis himself is excellent as a very sympathetic quasi-bad guy.
This makes me feel foolish!
While Next to Kin is a little bit low-key for the era, it's still a pretty decent little action film. It could have definitely benefited from more big action scenes. Probably the issue was that the company that produced it, Lorimar, actually went under around the time that this came out.
That was a bad one, all right.
Lorimar had done a few action movies that were pretty decent, like Action Jackson, Dead Bang, and this one, and they all got put out by Warner Brothers, but their budgets were lower than a lot of other films of the genre.
Pick it up.
If Next of Kin had a slightly heftier budget and a little bit more in the way of action scenes, it probably would have been a bigger movie.
I got 3 counties worth of kin that expect a certain amount of justice for that death.
And I remember actually interviewing Don Johnson not long ago, where he mentioned that Dead Bang was hampered by the fact that, they simply ran out of money as the film went on, and the end of the film was rushed.
It started with a death, but it's going to end with a bang.
Funny enough, the ending of Next to Kin is probably what works best in the film, although it's missing a good action scene to start the film off and probably could have had a little bit more in the way of carnage towards the middle of the film.
We ain't seen bad yet, but it's coming.
Action highlights include Liam Neeson busting up a pinball arcade, which is a pretty cool scene. And a chase sequence where he manages to avoid some mobsters using the L train, which is pretty neat. Swayze himself gets the finale, which is terrific, but he probably needed some other good fisticuffs mano-a-mano scene in the film. But alas, as it is, Next to Kin is pretty good, and it did okay at the box office, making about $17 million in North America. But, I guess that wasn't quite enough for it to really do a lot for Swayze's career as an action hero. Nonetheless, still kind of a fun movie, so make sure to check it out.
Have a good day now, you hear?